Okay, so thank everyone for joining this afternoon's Bridge to AI discussion forum on emerging ELSI issues. So today we had the pleasure to have Dr. Satyajit Ghosh, who is the Director of Open Data in Neuroscience Institute and Principal Research Scientist at McGovern Institute of Brain Research at MIT. He is also Assistant Professor of the ENT Department of Harvard Medical School. So he's a computer scientist and a computational neurologist by training. So today we'll welcome him to convey this very interesting topic about concepts of identity in voice, audio data processing, and anonymization. So without further ado, it's your room.
Thank you so much, Xiaoqian. I'm hoping I pronounced your name correctly. I'll just put a link to the slides on the chat if people want access to it. And I will share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, one of the hats I wear is representing the Precision Public Health Project for the Bridge to AI Consortium. So I couldn't but just put up that the Bridge to AI Voice Symposium is happening at the end of April. I believe Brad is speaking at that consortium. So
I'm speaking.
I'm just going to put it out there. There's a QR code that's also in the slides for those who are interested. There's a hackathon at the on the last day of the meeting that people can sign up for. And I did my due diligence in putting that out there. So with that, I'm going to move on to today's topic of the day, kind of thinking about concepts of identity in a voice. And I will approach this through the lens of both science and technology that covers processing and anonymization. And from what I've been told, I'm going to present for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions around this topic. As was sent out in the announcement, the word of the month is anonymization. And if we look at it, this idea of kind of trying to remove identifying information from something, in this case, could be voice, so that the original source cannot be known. And I want to keep these definitions in mind. They're from kind of standard sources. The second one is from GDPR. Anonymization, spelled with an S, is the process of rendering personal data anonymous. And while I go through the talk, keep in mind that I'm going to be talking about voice not just from identity as in who, but identity as a complex vector that may give rise to who I might be talking about altogether. So let me start with this video.
Hello, my name is Mike Mappis. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Modulate, which makes the world's first real-time voice skins. What that means is that this isn't actually my real voice.
Of course, this isn't my real voice either.
And I'm not quite dark and gritty enough for this to be my real voice.
This one's definitely not my real voice. But that's the beauty of voice skins. They give you the ability to become whatever character you wish.
Even if that character isn't a human at all. Want to learn more? Check out our website at modulate.ai.
So I wanted to put this out there as a way of thinking about voices. After all, we are listening to the same person speaking. When we think about identity, we attach it very much to this physical notion often of the person speaking. And as we just heard, did we look at 6 different identities because the voice was transformed? What do we think about identity? Is it just through the texture or the tools that transform our voice? Or is there something different from what could not be addressed in just changing the texture of voice as was done in this demonstration? And to get to this, we need to understand a little bit more of how voice is produced. Now, we have this incredible apparatus we use, most of us use at least, to speak quite fluently. And it's the texture, the vocal tract length, the nasal cavities that all contribute to what we might call the texture of voice. But then there's the brain. It helps us put in accents. It helps us convey different kinds of dialectical information. And all of this is influenced by a hearing system, which adjusts our pronunciation over time to reflect our environment where we have grown up. I still speak with some of my Indian accents coming through at times for specific words. 26 years, no, 27 years of being in this country hasn't changed some of those things. On the other hand, we also think about voice as something we want to convey to another. And one way to kind of think about voice is knowing somebody's voice makes it easier to understand what they're saying. So there is this nice chain of both what's happening within a person as well as how we're communicating with a listener. And if I look into the brain itself, this is kind of bold fMRI activity of people, of a person who's reading out aloud. We see that a significant real estate of the brain is devoted to this cognitive process of being able to read and produce some things. And this brings me to this idea that when we think about voice as an identity, we're also tapping into any kinds of disturbances that may have happened in any of these brain regions, which we may be able to potentially pick up through the lens of voice. Thus, identity is more than just who is speaking. It may also be a reflection of what their state is that we might be able to pick up. And I think of this voice as generating a complex high-dimensional vector space. Then different components of that space could be reflecting many different aspects that contribute to identity. And I may not need to know who the person is exactly to identify as the complexity of this vector space grows. I'm going to start with a simple part of this speech chain, our vocal tract. Our vocal folds can, under certain circumstances, get damaged. This was work done by Daniel Lowe, a former grad student in our group, trying to detect vocal fold paralysis from audio recordings. And along the way, we learned a few things. First off, that many machine learning algorithms are able to detect vocal fold paralysis from voice at a fairly high level. We're seeing AUC ROCs in the high 80s. Reading gives more information than just a sustained vowel or a combination of reading and vowel features. But also when we delve into the features, the most important feature that turned out to be relevant to this classification was equivalent sound level dB, or kind of a feature associated with the loudness of voice. Now, why is this important? Somebody with a vocal fold paralysis could be making an effort to speak louder. That's possible. They could also be making an effort to speak softer. So loudness could itself be a key. But it's also possible that I might be moving closer or further away, which changes some of these loudness characteristics. And knowing that my voice is weaker or louder, I might take some effect to kind of change the microphone to mouth distance if it's not set in a particular recording space. And finally, if somebody's acquiring this data in a clinic, if they're not paying attention and they're thinking about, oh, I can't hear this person, they might change the microphone gain itself, which also affects loudness. So loudness could have been affected by intrinsic properties of this individual, as well as technical aspects of how the voice was recorded. So we asked people, the clinicians, to listen to these voices and classify for us as if they were a machine learning algorithm. And when we did that, the ROC AUC for humans was not a chance. They could identify who had vocal fold paralysis, but it was not as high as the highest performing models either. However, when we ask clinicians to break down characteristics of voice into several dimensions, and we use its breakdown itself, as opposed to their binary decision making, whether this person has vocal fold paralysis or not, to a model. So we took their vector of features that they were describing the voice with. The model was able to do a much better job of identifying who had vocal fold paralysis or not. So this basic examples of a disruption in our vocal folds also now tells us that there are many ways of thinking about voice, that it could be affected by a physiological state, that machines could pick up on this physiological state and add a cell to this high dimensional vector of identity. And finally, technical challenges with how audio are recorded could itself affect the capabilities of models to understand this particular element in this high-dimensional space of a human. The second thing that Daniel did as part of his studies was he wanted to look at speech or voice-related characteristics of not a physiological state directly, but something that's higher up in that speech chain in the brain. This notion of could speech identify aspects of suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, or maybe even get to attempting to predict or track suicide attempts or the propensity for it. But what was important was kind of breaking up the space into these four different areas, kind of thinking about the psychology in the brain, thinking about the physiology that we understand a lot about, thinking about perception that humans and machines could be asked to monitor in this context, and then thinking about the acoustics that we get from it. And he put together this model, which we call the suicidal speech model, based on evidence from literature, based on information from his data that were put together. And as with all models, this model is probably wrong, but can be useful in guiding us to think about how acoustic features could internally relate back to many different dimensions of psychopathology. And this brings me to the Bridge to AI Voice project, or the Precision Public Health project. We are trying to get at this idea of what can we peek into the brain across lifespan, across various disorders, through the lens of various non-voice, voice, and speech tasks with demographic and acoustic confounders in tow, with validated questionnaires that can capture many different dimensions alongside these acoustic recordings, and clinical validation for those disorders for which we have concrete ways of validating that somebody has a specific disorder. In effect, we're trying to take this output, speech features or speech, and try to look back in towards the brain to say, could we get at cognitive state? Could we get at auditory damage? Could we get at Parkinson? Could we get at any kinds of things that we may not have direct access to through an instrument that's as easy as a microphone that records our vocal signal? And talking of this microphone recording the vocal signal, this paper came out last month. We can detect social symptom severity in children with autism using voice features. Again, another set of cells in a complex human vectorial space of who this person is. And we can start filling this up through various kinds of techniques that we have known for over a century almost in understanding and analyzing voice. Now, the waveform we've looked at over a century. Spectrograms came about during World War II. It wasn't earlier than that. But we can look at this voice through the lens of first principles. We understand how lungs largely behave. We understand how vocal folds are vibrating as a pressure differential between the lungs and the outside air. We understand characteristics of the oral cavity and the nasal cavity that shapes the sound, and we can look at the dynamics of voice, and that's something to keep in mind. You're hearing what I'm saying because I can modulate my articulators and my lungs in a way to convey what I'm saying through the dynamics. It's not a static signal. It's not a singular vector. It's not your genes. It changes over time. And we can take a slice of this and further look at kind of complex patterns that exist in a small time window of this voice. Now, when we think about identity, the first thing we think about is, can we detect who is speaking? And so Gasser, who was a master's student in our group and now is a PhD student in the program, and Fabio postdoc did some work on looking at this. So we took these old style analysis that we were capable of doing, acoustic features, baselines, which resulted in many of those features you saw on the previous slide, as one set of things that we can compare or ask, can we get vocal identity from this? But the world has changed. Today, we have supervised models. We have self-supervised models that are themselves either generative self-supervised models, contrastive self-supervised models, or predictive self-supervised models. The world is changing. I've just across over here listed about 18 models that we can evaluate. It's not just one model. It's not just one way of doing or identifying voice. When we ask these models to detect a speaker in a closed set of 1,251 speakers, where the model was essentially trained on a smaller subset with a set of these speakers set aside, or set of samples from these speakers set aside for detecting how well the model did, we see a whole lot of variation across the models on the left. On the right, what was done was to permute the weights of the models. In the ideal scenario, we would see all of the performance drop to the vertical line that says 0 on permuted weights, i.e., every model should be bad at recognizing who the speaker is, but that's not the case. So there's something even inherent in the structure of the model itself, not just the weights, the way we have constructed these models based on our knowledge of biology, based on our knowledge of how we think convolutions and other things work, that immediately provides some aspects of residual knowledge, even when the weights are perturbed with respect to identity. We weren't quite expecting that. And when we look at the internal representations of these models, we are also seeing a diversity of representations. Now, I'm not going to go into details of it other than to say that these pretty pictures should strike you as having different patterns, which means they're not all representing that underlying individual in the same way across these models. And that's something to keep in mind. We can't just think of one model for identity. We have to think about different models and how they're representing identity internally within the model. So to help with all of these, we have been building out a toolkit called SenseLab, which we call a one-stop kind of Python wrapper around existing tools to be able to process audio data well. And within this context, we are also building out what we are calling health features to be able to extract different kinds of these cells of what makes an individual. It's not just the who, again, it's the different characteristics that we could capture from voice to give that high-dimensional vector space. Now, it currently integrates algorithms for various things. I'm highlighting a few that are directly related to speaker. So speaker diarization, speaker embedding, speaker verification, and voice cloning are directly kind of related to what we might traditionally or consider the space of identity. And I'm going to use this toolkit for a project that we ran, or are still running, which is trying to use speech data to understand early detection and prevention of reading challenges. So this is in kids. We are looking at it to understand, could we predict who might have difficulty for reading at a future stage? And to start off that process, we didn't ask that question immediately. We said, how are people assessing how kids are doing with their reading? And some of the common assessments are speech assessments. They're not reading assessments because many kids don't read till later on. So a lot of people have developed various kinds of speech-based or auditory-based assessments that they can do without getting to the point of somebody reading as potential markers for risk for future reading. So in this case, we took a bunch of data from schools around the country and did what is normally done, a machine learning competition. We took data and said, hey, could you, the crowd around us, who are great at doing machine learning, help us understand or assist teachers in correcting what a kid said, given a set of specific tasks? Now, these were students from kindergarten to third grade, and going back to the speech chain, our voice, our vocal tract changes over time. So speech itself is evolving over that time span. Because these were kids' voices, we couldn't put the data out there directly. So we used a model called FreeVC to anonymize these voices. And this is simply saying, when you run FreeVC, we change the equal error rate. So equal error rate goes up, which means voices have been anonymized. And we also pay a penalty on word error rate. That means some of the recognition also is hampered as a function of this anonymization, but not enough to not do this study or not do this machine learning challenge. So we put out 38,000 voice samples from kids for people to train on that were anonymized. These were kids from, and I'm not going to go into details of the anonymization process because that's kind of a technical secret. If you knew that, you might be able to reverse engineer some aspects of this anonymization that comes along with it. And what were they doing? They were looking at a task A blending task would be you hear two words, foot and ball, and you're asked to say what does it sound like when combined together, and the kid would be expected to say football. A deletion task would be you hear the word birdhouse, and now you say what does it sound like without bird, and the kid would be expected to say house. And the goal of this competition was, could a model basically say whether for a given task a kid did it correctly or incorrectly. And we ran this model, and one of the nicest things is we reached some fabulous AUROCs for performance. This model, the competition ended last month. By comparison, the standard state-of-the-art general purpose whisper model was way down on the scale of being able to do this task. Now, this is a little unfair because it's a standard, and some of the highest performing models were essentially fine-tuned versions of that model. But it also tells you that when we deal with some of these standard tools without evaluating them, you don't really know what its capabilities are. So in thinking about identity, we have to continuously evaluate this. One of the nicest things about this competition was we didn't get to that final AUROC. I'm showing a plot of log loss, which is the middle column, so the lower is better, that over the span of time, it wasn't that we turned on the tap, everybody joined the competition, and then immediately hit the highest performing value the next day. It took a while. It took a while for people to develop the right models, understand the data, and get through it to get to a point. And remember, all of this was done on anonymized data. So this was a way of doing this evaluation where the private data set was held aside. So what you're observing here is the generalizability of the model they've put together. There's a second private data set that was also held aside that they never got to see even the results of evaluation on. And I can tell you that that evaluation was very close to these log losses and AUROC that people got to see. So we really think that these models are quite generalizable to unseen data and unseen kids across a pretty large population. And that brings me to one of the last slides I have over here. We use FreeVC for doing the conversion. So I'm going to go and play, and hopefully I can do this, a different approach to anonymizing voice. So here's the source signal.
Note has already been made of the first Edison plants afloat on the Jeannette and Columbia, and the first commercial plant in the New York lithographic establishment.
So this is a source voice. And what we're going to do is ask the question, can we map the source voice onto the target voice? So I'm going to just play a snippet from the target voice.
When she used to tell me about him, I always wondered whether she wasn't a little in love with him.
And now we're going to hear the converted voice.
Note has already been made of the first Edison plants afloat on the Jeannette and Columbia, and the first commercial plant in the New York lithographic establishment.
So just to go back, this was their source voice.
Note has already been made of the first Edison plants afloat on the Jeannette and Columbia, and the first commercial plant in the New York lithographic establishment.
And this is after.
Note has already been made of the first Edison plants afloat on the Jeannette and Columbia, and the first commercial plant in the New York lithographic establishment.
So what's different about this over FreeVC model? It introduces the notion that we can take speech audio and convert it to that physical representation of how we are moving our tongues, our lips, our vocal tract, and then use that representation back to create articulated synthesis. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this full model, but what they were able to do was generate a speaker embedding, generate these tracks which reflect how articulators change and move, and they were able to verify this with kinematic recordings of people. And we've done this in our lab a long time back, where we would stick pellets of different electromagnetic transducers on people's mouth, lips, tongues, teeth, and track what they were saying, and then restitch those information separately or jointly back together to synthesize something. And that's how they're able to achieve this kind of zero-shot conversion from one voice to another. But it gives us this insight that we are getting closer to a neural model, a biophysical model of how speech is made. And that might allow us with parameters that we can tweak to change texture, to change temporal characteristics, to change other components that are relevant to generating the sound. So I'm going to come back and end with the speech chain again. We've heard different components of this over the last few slides. We've kind of looked at how voice identity is not just who, but all the different kinds of features that we can extract. We've also heard how anonymized signals allowed us to run a machine learning challenge with sensitive voices that we could put out there that people could perform well on and help solve a task that's unrelated to the voice themselves. What we're really interested in are these neurocomputational models that model this neurobiophysical system that we don't have full access to through the lens of observable biomarkers, and hopefully whose features allow us to get at this system, whether it's looking at vocal fold paralysis, whether it's looking at suicidal attempt or ideation, whether it's looking for depression or other kinds of signals that are deeply held in our brains. There are lots of models out there, and we need to be continuously evaluating them to see their performance. In a closed set, we're close to 100%. In an open set, maybe not as much. But these models are evolving at such a rapid rate that we have to be on top of identifying what these models are capable of extracting from a vocal signal. And finally, having models that transform our voice, that we have control over in ways we understand how they transform our voice, will allow us a better space of thinking about when identity is essential for a downstream task and when identity can be hidden away for a downstream task. And hopefully we are entering a world where we can have these models and think about identity through these different lenses. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I think we have some time for discussion and questions.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. Any question from the audience? So maybe I can start with one question. I find this is very fascinating, but I was thinking like if you just want to do anonymization, you can basically convert the original speech to text and text to speech, or basically just give people text, all right? Because all they need is to use that to generate synthetic voice so that identity is removed. But if you want to keep a biomarker, how can you show what biomarker is kept and to what quality you can ensure the reconstructed voice still being clinical meaningful for downstream task?
So I can't answer that question for all the downstream use cases, but maybe I can take a few examples to kind of answer that question. Yes, one could simply convert to text and send it out. We would still have to consider PII. The first video I show, the first sentence that he says is, "I'm George Pappas, the CEO of Modulate.ai." So even simply converting to text would not solve the identity problem there. But anonymization, I think, can be achieved. And that's why I brought up this last example of speech synthesis based on articulatory speech synthesis. So this was from a group at Berkeley that built that model. And that model now decouples different elements that we can kind of think about. And that might help answer the question you're asking, which is if we knew certain biomarkers, and that could be temporal effects of how we coordinate some of these articulators. It could be the texture is all I care about in terms of anonymization. So I want to preserve the biomarker, which is embedded in the articulatory streams that are generated from the model, but I change the texture. So I generate anonymization without removing the biomarker. But I can easily see downstream tasks where somebody says, you know what, I want to anonymize where nobody can detect whether it's this person even has depression or Parkinson or not, right? So it is this more complex space of thinking about what properties or features of this high dimensional vector we want to keep and we want to throw out when we say we are doing anonymization. Because somebody might say, you know what, it's okay for my texture to be intact. I want to anonymize that I have a speech disorder. And this, I think, possibilities of models allow us to achieve some of these things. They're not perfect right now, but I think it gets to this point of we can tweak the knobs to understand what we keep and what we discard through the lens of anonymization.
Sam?
Thank you. Um, this is a fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. And my question is really very basic. Before I was ever really interested in humans, I was very interested in animal behavior. And many of the studies that were part of that learning and training had to do with learning how to identify an animal, a wolf, whatever, by the sound of their voice. And not only identify them, but to determine again what state, physical health status they were in by the sound of their cry or whatever vocalization they were having with another animal. And it seems to me that that form of study with animals has actually been around for a really long time, judging by my own age. And I'm wondering, what is it about humans that makes it so much more difficult that we might not have yet been able to apply what we learned in animals about the individual distinctions of who they are and how they feel and so on, and make the current study of voice so difficult?
Oh, that has so many different components. Thanks, Sam, for asking that question. Uh, I would start with kind of first principles. Let's start there, which is we have a respiratory system, we have a vocal tract. We have this vocal tract that changes over time, right? As a baby, it's a much shorter vocal tract. There's sexual dimorphisms in the lengthening of vocal tracts over once till one hits adolescence. Uh, and so, but we know how to model it. We know how to kind of think about the acoustics that are produced from the wave equation, which was from the late 1800s. So again, people have studied a lot of these components of the physics of generating sound for a long time, and we know how to understand that and do that. What's, I think, not so clear is the neural control of that sound generating process. Hence, the anonymization process of simply changing the texture is something that's simpler to do, right? And it sounds different. But if I can have a model ignore texture and simply pay attention to your rate effects, that's not going to be that straightforward now to hide away that somebody speaks. And the analogy I'll give is somebody walks with a certain gait. And you can recognize somebody from their gait rather than what they look like, right? So the notions of how behavior manifests itself in the voice come from many sources. So articulatory control gives rise to a lot of these rate effects. I might pause more, I might talk slowly, I might pitch accent certain parts of sentences and words, and those might be unique to me. And then if I think of accents, right, dialects and dialectical variation, somebody from Southern Michigan says the word had almost like had. I had my cake. Uh, and that's a kind of thing, if we simply anonymize based on texture, I would still have the geographical notion that this person is likely from Southern Michigan still intact in there. Hence, when we think about anonymization, we have to think about all these pieces of information that could be embedded in voice. Okay, so far I've kind of just talked about articulation dynamics. On the neural control side, and one of the reasons I put up the real estate taken up by a cognitive process like speaking is if I have insult or injury to some of those regions, that's going to affect my voice in a particular way. For some of the other elements like cognitive decline, or depression or anxiety, that's going to affect my voice in different ways. And we simply don't know that process well enough right now. So even though we've studied animals and animal behavior and other things, some of these still remain quite invisible and hidden to us. Now, we're playing with machine learning models. We're doing all kinds of single cell genomics and other things to get at these circuitries. But we're far away from a purely causal pathway from some set of neurons firing in our brain to say, I have to say the word Sam to it actually coming out in some way. So hopefully that answers some of the elements to relation to behavior.
It does. Thank you.
Another question is, in terms of identity, which one do you see more risky? The context, the content, or the voice itself?
Oh, that's a tough question, Shashat. Can I just say all of them? Or or is it a first choice question? I have to
No, no,
select
no.
one.
No, just based on your experience, like maybe you give us a ranking. So because you see thousands of these, so maybe you can tell us what is more vulnerable.
From a human perspective, I would say texture.
Extra.
But from a model perspective, it's all of them. Because a model could completely ignore texture, as I was just telling Sam, and just pay attention to our articulation dynamics or our acoustic dynamics, the temporal aspects of voice, and say, you know what? I might be able to detect who this person is.
Hey, Brad.
So models make our life difficult in the context of identity.
Totally.
So Satrajit, this is an amazing talk. I will admit I stole all your slides and I'm probably going to reuse them. I want to play a little bit more on the concept of anonymization and the definition of anonymization. You began by talking about the different ways in which law and regulation represents it. And you talked about a little bit of the continuum of anonymization. I want to know, I want to dig into some of your research results a little bit more in this respect. So when you go to measure the similarity, or when you try to re-identify an individual, what do you claim to be a re-identification? So if I have an anonymous voice or a transformed voice, and I'm going to try and name the individual or match it back to some set of records for them, does it require a top one match? Or do you consider like what happens if you have an adversary who's willing to tolerate more error? So like top two, a match in the top five, a match in the top 10. How do you guys perform your evaluations?
Many of those things come into play for different circumstances, right? I think evaluation wise, you could run all of them. The question I think one would need to ask is, what am I doing this matching for? Right? Whether it's to gain entry into a house or whether I'm going to be able to access my bank account over the phone when my voice kind of dials in. And I think that's where the challenges and differences of those approaches kind of come in. So if you took those slides, I would say go and look up Gopala's paper, which was the last one I showed, because there's a very nice table of zero-shot identification in that paper. The idea that just the top one match gets you close enough to a lot of different components when you do that. And that group compares multiple different models in that particular case, so you can see kind of a range of performance. It's not 100% performance, but it gets you close enough. So that brings me to the kind of second question. It's like, how many mistakes are we okay to live with when using top one? Is 10% mistakes okay? Or is 20% okay? Or is zero the goal, that you'd never make a mistake? So I think this is where what you're using it for kind of matters quite a bit. Now, in case of
Well, let me pause you on that. Sorry. Finish your thought.
no, go ahead, Brad. I was going to come back to the top 2 or 3 case next.
Okay, so play out the top 10, the error rate, right? Your false positive rate. So I think this assumes that the adversary would try to attack everybody, right? But they might not have sufficient confidence with some of the records, or they might have like a probability of being correct with respect to each of them, some level of uncertainty. And so they might, restrict their claims. to the ones for which they're the most confident on, right? We've seen this in plenty of situations. So if you're going to go about making assessments with respect to anonymization, does the magnitude of the attack play into your concerns?
I think this is where I'm not a politician, but perception seems to matter to an attack. And I'll take an example of the Netflix prize as something we could perhaps discuss in this particular case. So this was anonymized data, or what we considered anonymized data. And then somebody dug into it and was able to identify by correlating kind of rows of information in the table. So for those people who don't know, Netflix had a prize in the first decade of this century that said, hey, machine learning experts, we're running a competition. Can you tell us which movies are more likely to be watched by a person, or what kind of rating they would have given this table of data that we have collected from our subscribers? And this was put out there, and on, just cursory look, it would look like this is de-identified data. But somebody was able to take that data and they were able to identify a bunch of people based on other information that they were also placing on the public internet around it. They didn't have to be perfect. So from an attack perspective, even if they got some level of people, they were able to put something out there that made Netflix withdraw their second prize challenge as a result of perception, right? This is not so much a technical thing. This is more this notion of what can society live with in certain ways. That being said, if you look at YouTube, if we look at social media in general, many people's identity and voices are out there. So definitely a whole lot of people in society are completely fine with having their voices out there. Now, did they know all the other things I can collect from their voice as part of processing that voice signal? Perhaps, perhaps not. We tend to kind of think about the information we get. So coming back to that top one thing, I think I go back to that notion of what is it for, right? If it's for attacks where somebody can steal my bank account, it would have to be close. It would have to be perfect, right? If it's for something where somebody says, I don't know, all the examples I can think of are places where I would need it to be perfect. I would love to hear thoughts on places where it's like, okay, top 2 or 3 are allowed in here. Uh, but the top 2 or 3 could be used for more categorical stuff, right? If I'm thinking of certain disorders and I'm predicting if somebody has it, it's like, could I do a majority vote among the top 2 or 3, and that's sufficient to get me to a disorder category or a certain other category? There, I could live with the top 2 or 3. We were looking at a model where people were ablating units and it would start generating gibberish. It's a language model, start generating gibberish. And then somebody asked, okay, if I don't use the top logit and instead look at the second or the third logit, did it generate the right answer then? And they found that, oh, yes, given the context I was providing the model and what I was expecting it to do, even though that the top logit was generating gibberish, there was information in the second and third logit in terms of the information I was expecting from the model. So to come back to your question, I think it really depends on what you're using that model for and what you're okay to live with. Maybe that's a cop-out, but that's my answer.
It's a cop-out. I was going to, I have one more question, but I'm going to get back in the queue.
Okay.
I think Julie first.
Yeah, thanks. This is a really fascinating discussion. And I'm kind of building off of one of the things Brad brought up, but this idea of maybe more outliers, the more distinct or famous people. I can think of voice in just not even what they're physically saying and how it sounds, but how they typically speak. So I could read a quote, for example, and say like, "Oh, that's Bernie Sanders." Like he's so unique in how he phrases things. I might hear his voice in my head, but he's not actually speaking. And I can think of a number of people that have very unique voices and speaking patterns. And I'm wondering, have you played with that? Because I always kind of feel like if we can anonymize at the like riskiest use case, somebody that's famous and has a ton of, you know, recordings available publicly, then anonymizing somebody like me who's kind of nobody is pretty easy, Uh, have you played with that at all, or what are your thoughts?
We haven't played with it, but it goes back to I think the answer I was giving Sam earlier, that this idea that as you have voice, there are all kinds of patterns in it. It's not just the texture, which is what most of these things currently use to identify a voice. And as we get more sophisticated models, we will be able to, I think, do both, right? We will be able to identify voices better because we have more sophisticated, but should also be able to anonymize. So it's going to be, I think, this dueling chain of anonymization techniques and identification techniques. And then it depends on how much voice do you need for someone. So for the example that I gave with voice celeb, that data set, as the Vox celeb, that data set is from celebrities because there's a lot of public data and they're speaking in all these different circumstances, different times of day, which affects our voice, etc. So uh, that's a little bit of, I think, a window into your question, in the sense that we actually did use a Voxelab data set. The other part to this is, how many people here are fans of The Simpsons? How many voices do you think Hank Azaria voiced?
Didn't the New York Times just do a whole thing on this?
Possibly. If you send me a point, I haven't seen it, Brad, but if you do have a pointer, I would love to read it. A lot. I think he did almost close to 20 voices over The Simpsons. So it also tells us how humans can change. And it's not just Hank. It's many of these actors can do all kinds of fantastic, phenomenal manipulation. And I would ask the question, is it still their voice? And so
Would
this is
you be able to get the biomarker though, like that you're looking for if it was a health study? If somebody is manipulating their own voice intentionally, wouldn't
I
that,
don't know the answer to that,
yeah.
Julie.
Sorry.
This almost sounds like a voice actor study that I would have to do. And somebody on whom I collect all those clinical aspects and that I could, and then ask the question, independent of your acting status, can I detect some of these underlying features? For certain disorders, I feel like I might be able to get to it, but those are also some of the disorders that tend to put people out of acting, like neurodegenerative disorders. Your patterns start changing. And so I think this is a complex enough question that we need some new data to be able to answer. But great question, Julie. Thank you.
Laura, sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Satyajit, for your presentation. Very interesting. I got particularly interested in your slide mapping the relationship between the different disorder, the brain, then the like how it affects like the vocal tract and the speech feature. And I was wondering how far are we in terms of this mapping? So, for example, if we take depression, Parkinson, which are well studied, but maybe also like autism, where we are less far in terms of understanding, like how well do we grasp this different relationship today?
So what we know today is more like the direct jump between voice and some of the disorders. And there are certain disorders for whom we have that connection fairly robust. So neuromuscular disorders are a category where clinicians use this all the time for both diagnostic and prognostic purposes. For autism, there's some work that we are doing and others are doing, and I presented one of the studies that just came out, right, to kind of look at a social scale. However, the connecting layer, what's happening where in the brain to give rise to the changes that we are acoustically picking up in relation to a given disorder, we are some, I don't know, light years away, maybe? No, hopefully not. But we're a long way away from that perspective. Is what is it about the cells, the circuits, the neural control that give rise to the information that's in the acoustical signal that we can use to say, hey, this person has autism or this person has depression. I think it's much easier for us to now say, we can make that association. We can build all kinds of models to say somebody has MCI or mild cognitive impairment or dementia or Alzheimer's disease. There are fairly robust models of detecting a disorder or looking at the information. Some work is being done to say where in that acoustic signal are you seeing that information, and that's going to give some insight. So in the context of depression, we've done some work that says durations affects. And we've also done some brain imaging work, which I did not show you, that suggests some specific regions of the brain are implicated in the variations we are seeing in people with depression. But I don't know what that model or the circuit looks like or what's happening yet. If somebody does, if somebody's on this call and somebody knows, I would love to know. But I think we are still some miles away from.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting area to investigate, but of course, I think miles at least miles away.
Yes.
But I'll definitely read the paper on autism. But I was wondering if you could tell a bit more, because autism it's a spectrum, so it's not like depression, Parkinson, where it's easier to map out. There is a really large spectrum. So how do you look at it?
It's a very complex space. Now, to be even be able to record voice, you're reducing the spectrum to about 60%, because there's about 34% of people with autism who are what we would say minimally verbal. They make sounds. They don't make sounds like you and I are doing in this call today. So even across the spectrum, that's almost automatically reduces that space. Then there is kind of variations, even within that space of highly functioning folks, and then a whole range of people who have various levels of disability. Then there are kind of comorbidities like intellectual disability and others. So what I liked about that paper was that there was a simple process that said we can detect, and they cross-validated it's in a particular place on the planet. So even generalizability to other places on the planet, I would love to see. What's nice is they've made their code, their models all openly available. So if somebody else has similar data, they could run it and see how well. And that's the part of open science I would like to see, right? Being able to say, we can detect this, we've put our models out there, you can run it through the same processes and see how well it works in your cohort. But autism is, I think, too easy for me to say that it's such a heterogeneous space that I would like to see much more scale that even they did. And some people would consider their study large. It was 300 people-ish. I would see a larger cohort and space, and geographic diversity in terms of variations in various acoustic and speech features that happen because of different languages.
Yeah, we have some data on autism, so I think I'll definitely try it.
I think Sam has another question. Yeah.
Camille, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to ask your question, because this is my second, and I know we're running out of time.
So nice of you, Sam. I'm okay. I'll follow up with you, Satra, later.
Sounds good, Camille.
I'm just going to ask something somewhat similar to what I was thinking before, and that is whether or not, and I know you've said that there's a lot of factors that are in constant motion in producing a vocalization, but whether or not you and other scientists have been able to distinguish if states that are more extreme, such as disorder or physical injury or illness or emotion, have less variability in their spectrum, whereas vocalization that are made in somewhat of a neutral, non-emotional state, good health state, whatever that may be, are more varied. And if that actually adds to the sort of perturbation of how do you distinguish it?
Oh, another great question. First thing I would want to know is somebody's baseline state, because we have a lot of intrinsic differences across people in just their baseline levels. Some people just naturally speak slower. So while we see certain effects like some certain temporal effects in depression, I can't generalize that. And I think this is where this world of precision modeling kind of comes in. And while longitudinal data is necessary, I mentioned earlier, over the day, my voice changes. Uh, does my articulation change? Probably. If I'm sleep deprived, I'm in a different mode than if I'm, uh, energetic. I change the dynamics. I'm using more prosthetic contours, etc. Whether we can cut through all that variation and get at underlying features that stay stable, and I think this is related to Julie's question as well about a lot of voices of celebrities out there that would help us kind of maybe answer that question, which is, can we cut through the variations? How do we say what aspects of those variations are irrelevant and whether for certain disorder categories that's reduced? Now, I can give a very classic example, ALS, where it deteriorates to a level where variation goes down, right? That's a very easy example for me to give to say, as it deteriorates, neuromuscular control goes down, and you get to the point where there's been a lot of studies, a lot of speech language pathologists and others who study ALS use "Buy Bobby a puppy" as a classic kind of sentence because it makes the mouth move and touch different parts. And over time, you can't even recognize anything other than somebody was attempting to make words at those places. And so there's certain disorders, definitely. And I think if we go across the set of disorders we are considering in the Bridge to AI Voice project, which is pediatric communication disorders, that's a very large space of many different kinds of disorders. The neurological disorder space, the large ones are Alzheimer's and Parkinson, but there's many more like ALS. Incidence rate is much less, so we don't have that many samples. But neuromuscular disorders, as I was talking about earlier, psychiatric disorders, which is something we deal with in our own group, is a very messy space. And we've seen all kinds of things across different kinds of, because there's also comorbidity across these disorders. A person with Parkinson may easily have depression or anxiety. PTSD, given its different formations, is a very complex set of domains. So I think we're only scratching the surface right now in what's possible and capable and understanding, and hence this collection of generating a large enough data sets that's well qualified will then allow us to, I think, peel away the features that we can convincingly say not relevant to the specificity of a disorder.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent summary. And I think we had a really great presentation and discussion session. Let's thank Dr. Ghosh. And in a month's time, we will have our next session, March 18th, re-identification risk in wearable sensor. So, so we look forward to see you again. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Take care. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Take care.